A recalibration is underway. In just 6 months, global finances have tumbled. Some nations have been hit harder than others, and some sectors feeling more of a grind. For more than 80 years, Broadway Engineering in Bristol has made parts for Rolls-Royce engines. But right now, nobody's flying.
How much has the civil fallen off and how much has the defence picked up?
I think really an awful lot, like a big percentage. We're talking like 50% of the civil, if not more, has dropped away. Defence has stayed pretty firm, which has been really positive for us. But it's looking really more like 2022, 23 before we really start to see that growth pick back up.
That's a long recovery because this is the deepest recession on record, confirmed today by official growth figures. At the peak of the last recession, the economy shrunk by 2.1%. The COVID effect dwarfs that, down 20.4% in the second quarter of this year. This hasn't just been bad, it's been worse than every other G7 nation, a contraction double the size of that in the USA. There was some good news though. From a low base, GDP grew by 8.7% in June. But they're just numbers. The real effect for many people is job losses.
It's devastating. You know, lots of these guys have been here for 30, 40 years, and we're going to be protecting everybody that we can, and it'll be an absolute last resort where we may have to make a couple of, strategic changes, really. But we will be protecting as many people as we can.
In normal times, tough numbers for government are accompanied by ministers telling us things aren't so bad. But these aren't normal times.
Well, when we were talking about this a few months ago, I said that hard times were coming, and today's figures show that hard times are here. Hundreds of thousands of people have already lost their job, and sadly, many more will. But I will say to people, although tough decisions lie ahead for all of us, no one will be left without hope or opportunity.
It might be small, but there has been an upturn in economic activity. And of course, what everyone's desperate to know is, will that continue? So economists are looking at all sorts of indicators. For instance, people searching for directions on Apple Maps increased by 11% in June, which is encouraging. But on the flip side, people Googling phrases that include the word redundancy, well, that increased in July to a record high.
That search may well lead people here. Nigel and his team don't just offer advice to job seekers, but to firms about to make staff redundant. With the furlough scheme about to end, he says there has been a major increase in companies getting in touch.
It is pretty scary. A lot, it varies. So some companies are just laying a few people off, and then you've got your bigger companies, your aerospaces or whatever, we're talking some quite large volumes. And it's really trying to accommodate that and try and offer a service to everyone when we're talking some quite big numbers of people.
And when you're looking at those big numbers, are there jobs out there for them to transition into?
Well, this is another matter as well, because what's been going on recently, obviously some of the people being made redundant now, highly skilled people, and at the moment there aren't really those vacancies for them to go into.
With few high-skilled jobs available, even lower-skilled jobs are now harder to come by. Marketing professional Rhiannon was made redundant last month.
I have applied for smaller stuff like cafe roles and things like that, but then they just keep coming back to me and saying we know that you're probably going to leave if you get another job. It is hard, but I feel like maybe, 20 jobs I've applied for that I think I would have had a shot at,
Rhiannon's hope is now opening her own catering firm, Cooking Honey. But for the rest of the economy, we are still mid-pandemic. No vaccines yet, no end in sight or size known for the financial toll on all of us.
Well, I'm joined now by Rupert Harrison, who was formerly Chief of Staff to George Osborne when he was Chancellor and is now Portfolio Manager at BlackRock. Also joining me is Miata Fambula, who is Chief Executive at the New Economics Foundation, which is a left-wing think tank. Miata, this is what some might call a world-beating recession. Was it inevitable that we would be in a deeper recession than other comparable countries?
No, look, we knew it was going to be a massive knock to the economy. All the projections were suggesting this was going to be the deepest contraction for centuries, and I think these figures confirm that. Why we have done significantly worse than other countries, I think in part is a function of the fact that we went into lockdown a little bit later. So the figures, if you like, weren't showing in the first quarter, they're showing in the second quarter. But also because we were late going into lockdown, we had to hold restrictions for much longer. But the more fundamental point for me is that, even going into the pandemic, our economy was pretty weak. We were stagnating. And so the knock of the pandemic and the recession came on top of an economy that was already ailing.
Rupert Harrison, do you agree with that?
I agree that I think the two main reasons probably that the UK has had a bigger fall in this quarter than other developed economies are exactly that. We went into lockdown later and stayed in lockdown longer. So most of this second quarter was accounted for by that lockdown period. And we've only really got the beginning of the bounce back in June counted in these figures. I also think there's probably a factor that the UK economy is very dominated by a very large service sector, very large. A lot of the parts of the service sector that we all know have been most affected are very large in the UK. I think that the key thing is we're only, as you heard at the end of your report, we're only halfway through this process. We've only had the plunge, we've had the beginning of the bounce back. All the latest indications are actually that bounce back has continued pretty strongly in July and August. So I think we have to wait until we've seen the full shape of the recession before we can start to really judge, performance in comparison to other countries.
But the lesson is that there isn't a trade-off between health and the economy. The two things go hand in hand. So it's kind of what you do now becomes critical. And if the government's policy is effectively to have an acceptable level of infection that lasts for a long, long time, then this uncertainty could go on months, if not years, couldn't it?
Well, look, the only thing that can really end the uncertainty is to get a vaccine and to get back to normal life. Most countries in the world are trying to get infections down to manageable levels where they can be dealt with by track and trace. I think your basic statement is correct. There isn't a trade-off. You look at what's happened in the United States, particularly the southern states in the United States, where you have had this big second wave. And we have seen evidence that the measures necessary to get back on top of that have led to a levelling off in spending. The US was, like the UK, seeing a very, very dramatic bounce back in activity levels, spending levels. We saw that in the kind of more up-to-date data than this GDP data we've had today, which is quite backwards looking. And that started to level off. So I think it's certainly true that a significant second wave would be the worst thing for the economy. But I do think that it is possible to continue a pretty rapid bounce back while having and maintaining a low level of cases, as long as those cases are not rising in a dangerous way.
Well, Miata Fambula, Rupert is talking about the bounce back, but the Chancellor is talking about hard times being here. What should the government do now?
Well, look, the biggest risk at the moment is mass unemployment. So alongside the economy essentially plummeting, there will be jobs that will be lost. And that has to be the priority for the government. I think the first order priority is to protect jobs. And the Chancellor has said that he won't extend the furlough scheme. I think that is a grave mistake because when there are still parts of the economy that are in lockdown, when we're asking parts of the economy to operate well below capacity because of social distancing restrictions that the government has put in place, we absolutely must continue providing protections. But the government is also going to have to create a lot of jobs. It's talking the language of fiscal stimulus, but not providing the sort of stimulus in the kind of magnitude that we need to get the economy going again. And we need to...
But if we had lockdowns for another year, would you keep the furlough scheme going for another year?
Yeah, well, so if you look across to Germany, you look across to France, they're extending their scheme for 21 months, 22 months, because they recognise that we are still in the eye of the storm of the pandemic, and the biggest risk and cost and damage to the economy is the scarring effect of mass unemployment. If you can keep people in the labour market and you blend it with things like retraining and placing people into sectors where that makes sense, we have a chance of recovering from this. If we don't do that, the scarring impacts on this will be with us for decades.
Rupert Harrison, why is the scheme ending when the pandemic hasn't?
Well, look, I agree this is the absolute key judgment for the government. It's not quite true that other countries are extending their furlough schemes for that long a period of time. No one is trying to extend a furlough scheme that just keeps people at home. And I think the government are absolutely right that we can't keep, people at home. We can't deliberately try and freeze the economy as it was back in February. We have to allow some evolution so that the economy can adjust to genuine changes. The economy at the end of this year is going to look very different to the beginning of this year. Fewer people are going to go on holiday abroad. More people are going to go on holiday at home. People are going to be spending less money on services like restaurants. They're going to be spending more money on other things like goods and things that they're buying. And an economy needs to adjust to that. And so you are seeing around the world that no countries essentially are just trying to freeze their economies. But of course, how you manage the exit from that furlough scheme is very, very delicate. I think that if you do get into a significant second wave later in the year, which I have to say I think is quite unlikely. At the moment, the data on the virus are pretty good in the UK. And actually, indeed, in most of Europe, with the possible exception of Spain. But if you do get into a significant second wave, I think the government would be forced to extend the furlough scheme. I think Rishi Sunak probably knows that. But I think they're hoping that if the rapid bounce back continues, then you might get, try and rightly judge the kind of handover from this extraordinary and massive government support to the private sector continuing to bounce back in the second half of the year.